Introduction. Hart's claim and the question. David Bentley Hart states a hard truth in the experience of God. Denying divine simplicity is tantamount to atheism. But is he right? Is denying divine simplicity really tantamount to atheism, really? What exactly does divine simplicity mean in his usage, and what larger argument is he leaning on? Is this merely a boundary policing theological claim, or is it the upshot of a worked philosophical achievement? To see what is at stake, we have to recover the line of reasoning that sets the standard for what counts as an ultimate source. That line runs through Aristotle, Avicenna, Maimonides, and Aquinas, and it yields a stringent profile of the first cause, actuality without remainder, unity without a composer, and no membership in any genus. If that profile holds, Hart's sentence begins to look less like provocation and more like a conclusion. In what follows, we sketch that history and show how it illuminates and explains Hart's claim. Aristotle 1. From change to pure act. Start with the basic intuition Aristotle sharpens whenever something changes. What brings about that change must already be actual in the relevant way. What is merely potential can't make itself actual. A cold thing doesn't heat itself without something already hot. A learner doesn't become knowledgeable without some actual knower or knowing act at work. So every instance of motion or change leans on an actual cause proportion to the effect. Follow that trail back, and you face a choice. Either you have an endless series where each mover is itself moved by another, or you arrive at a first cause that does not derive its causal power from something prior. An infinite regress of moved movers never delivers actuality. Each link would still be waiting on another to be already actual. If there is change here and now, there must be a terminus that doesn't need to be moved in order to move. That terminus is what Aristotle calls an unmoved mover, a cause that brings about motion without itself being put into motion. The point isn't that it once moved things long ago, but that its causal role doesn't depend on any prior activation. It gives without receiving, so to speak. If it were in any respect waiting to be actualized, it would fall back into the queue of moved movers and stop being explanatory. Hence the conclusion, the first cause must be actuality through and through, pure act, with no unrealized potency. Any leftover potential would require a further actualizer and reopen the regress. Pure act is simply the name for a source that needs no boost to do what it does, and so can underwrite the actuality showing up everywhere else. Aristotle 2. Why real unities need a unifier. Think about any genuine whole, a living body, a syllable, a geometrical figure. It isn't just a heap of bits lined up next to each other. A body is more than organs in a pile. A syllable is more than letters stacked. A triangle is more than three sides floating apart. In each case, there's a more that turns a many into one thing. Aristotle's point is that this more isn't magic. It calls for explanation. If the whole really exceeds a mere aggregate, something must be doing the unifying. Some principle or factor that makes the parts belong together as one. In familiar cases, we can name it. In matter, it might be contact or cohesion. In living things, form. In artifacts, the ordering intention of an agent. So the lesson scales up. Whenever there's a real unity of distinct elements, there is a cause of that unity. Mere side-by-side placement or tallying of parts won't do. Aggregation describes the many. It doesn't explain the one. Therefore, wherever a plurality is truly one, and not just a heap, there must be a cause of unity over and above the parts themselves. Unity, when real, is an achieved state, and what is achieved calls for a unifier. Aquinas I. From unity pressures to absolute simplicity. Start with what composite means, anything made of really distinct constituents. Parts, aspects, or principles stands after those constituents in being. The parts are ontologically prior, the whole depends on them. If you remove the parts, the whole goes. If you posit the whole, you presuppose the parts. In this sense, every composite is posterior to, and dependent upon, what composes it. Next, no composite is one all by itself. Distinct elements do not fuse into a single thing without something to do the fusing. Wherever a plurality is truly one rather than a heap, there is a cause of unity, a composer, a form, an ordering act, by virtue of which the many belong together as one. But the first principle, by definition, is uncaused and prior to all. It is the terminus of explanation, not something that borrows unity or being from anything else. If it depended on parts, it would be posterior to them. If it needed a composer, it would be caused. Either way, it would fail to be first. Therefore, the first principle cannot be composite. It must be absolutely simple, not a resultant of prior constituents, not a bundle of really distinct features needing a unifier, but that in which no internal dependence or posteriority can obtain. Aquinas II, with Aristotle, not in a genus, no common measure. To be in a genus is to be carved up by genus and specific difference, a common. In determinate nature, the genus is made determinate by an added differentia. That very structure imports composition and a tilt toward potency. The generic content is perfected by the difference. But on Aquinas' account, God's essence is identical with his very act of existing, state I, Q3, A4. A being that is pure act cannot be built up from a generic potency plus an added perfection, so the genus difference scheme cannot apply to the first. Aristotle tightens the screw. Neither being nor one can function as a genus, because any differentia would already have to be and be one, which leaves nothing outside the genus to do the differentiating metaph. 33. If even being and unity are not genera, there is no highest umbrella kind under which God could fall. Hence Aquinas concludes, God is not in any genus, stai, Q3, A5. What is first in reality admits no prior, more general measure, no common scale on which it is ranked alongside others. The upshot is both metaphysical and semantic. God cannot be treated as one instance among many, under a shared kind, and divine predicates are not ticking off added pieces to a common nature. Rather, creatures are measured by participation in perfections that exist in God. Eminently, God is exemplar measure, not a commensurate unit within a genus. Avicenna, the necessary existent and pure existence. Avicenna starts from a modal contrast. Possible beings, anything that might exist but need not, have a what it is, a quiddity or essence that can be described without thereby guaranteeing that such a thing actually is. A triangle, a horse, a planet. Each can be defined in kind, and yet whether any exist depends on something further. Their existence is received, not of themselves. By contrast, the necessary existent is not like that. Its being is not tacked on to an essence. It is not a recipient of existence. Avicenna puts the point with maximal sharpness. The first has no quiddity other than his individual existence. The first's that it is and what it is coincide. Were there any daylight between essence and existence here, the first would fall on the side of the possible, needing a giver of being, and so would not be first. From this identity follow two decisive exclusions. First, there is no composition of essence and existence at the summit, nothing. In the first plays the role of a receiver to which existence is added. Second, there is no genus membership for the first, since genus and specific difference are constituents of a quiddity. If there is no quiddity beyond necessary existence itself, there is nothing common. To share and then further to delimit, no kind can stand over the first. The same identity also rules out any internal addition of parts, properties, or really distinct positives. Addition is the mark of what derives, but the first is pure existence, existence itself without admixture or supplement. Hence, on Avicenna's analysis, the necessary existent is absolutely simple. Its very what it is identical with its existing, and so it neither composes nor belongs under any wider measure. Maimonides, unity without superadded attributes. Maimonides sharpens the unity question by asking what follows if we ascribe to God multiple essential attributes as really distinct positives, say wisdom, power, goodness, each as an item in God. On that supposition, we have as many uncaused eternal realities as there are such attributes, or else we owe a composer to make them one. Either way, ultimacy is lost. A caused unity would make God posterior to what unifies him, while a coordinate plurality would yield many basics at the summit rather than one first. His remedy is categorical. True belief in the divine unity, he argues, requires that God be one simple substance, no composition. By parts or principles, no plurality on any side, not divisible by any cause. Calling something an attribute of God in the strict sense would mean adding to what he is, but whatever is superadded is accidental in force, and so a mark of composition. Hence, essential positive attributes are excluded. What remains are negations of creaturely, defect, and acknowledgments that perfections found in creatures derive from God. Read against the earlier results. This is not a mere linguistic caution, but a metaphysical consequence. Principle 3 had already ruled that every composite is posterior, and caused, Principle 4 barred any common measure or genus at. The top, Principle 5, identified the first's what it is with existence itself, leaving no quiddity to which anything could be added. Together they close the door on a God who has many really distinct essentials. Any such plurality would either need a unifier and so be caused, or stand as many basics and so forfeit unity. The positive upshot is that divine unity demands absolute simplicity. Our many concepts, wisdom, power, goodness, are diverse ways we grasp the one simple reality that God is. They do not mark many constituents in God. Predication, then, proceeds by denial of defect and by analogy, what these names signify preeminently is identical with the simple essence. Thus the unity Maimonides defends is not a thin minimum, but the metaphysical guarantee that the first principle is not a resultant of prior elements at all. Synthesis, how the lines interlock and what they imply. Begin with pure actuality. If the first cause explains motion and change without itself being moved, then its mode of being must already be fully actual. There can be no reserve of potential that waits to be completed by something else. This sets the tone for everything that follows. A source that is actuality, through and through, cannot be pieced together from principles that stand in potency to a finished whole, since any such potency would call for an actualizer beyond the source itself. Next, consider the cause of unity. Whenever many items are truly one rather than a heap, there is an explanation for that oneness. Forms unify matter, agents bring potentials into act, and definitions gather notes into a single nature. Apply that pattern at the summit and the pressure increases. If the first were a plurality of really distinct items, its unity would either be caused by something further or would fail to be a genuine unity. The very search for an ultimate requires that the source not stand in need of a composer. These two lines meet in the simplicity result. Aquinas codifies them as categorical rules. Every composite is posterior to and dependent on its parts, and every composite has a cause that makes the many to be one. Since the first is uncaused and prior, it cannot be composite in any respect. Simplicity is not a taste for austerity. It is the refusal to place what is first within any pattern of dependence that would make it an effect of more basic constituents. Simplicity then pairs with a denial of genus membership. To be in a genus is to have a common nature made specific by an added difference. That structure imports a real composition of determinable and determinate. The first cannot be measured or ranked by a common kind, more general than itself, since that would make it posterior to a scheme that explains what it is. Not being in a genus is the logical face of pure act, where there is no determinable nature that waits on a difference. There is no common scale that ranges over God and creatures alike. Avicenna sharpens the picture from the side of modality. Possible things have a whatness that can be conceived without affirming that they exist. The first does not. Its what it is nothing but to be necessarily. There is no essence to which existence is added, and therefore no materials for internal addition at all. With quiddity removed, genus and differentia have no foothold at the summit, and the last familiar avenue for composition is closed. The first is pure existence without the kind of addition that marks recipients. Maimonides draws the practical consequence for how we speak. If what is first is not built up from a plurality, then multiplying essential attributes in God would either smuggle in parts or proliferate many uncaused basics. True unity requires that the perfections we name be identical in reality with the simple essence, and that our plurality lie in the order of our concepts. Hence the discipline of negative predication and analogy. We deny creaturely defect and affirm that whatever perfection creatures possess by participation exists in God in a higher way. Taken together, the 6 principles yield a single profile. The ultimate source is pure act, uncaused, outside any genus, without quiddity added, and therefore absolutely simple and one. From that profile flow immutability, eternity, aseity, and the uniqueness of the first cause, not as accessories but as entailments of what it is to be the unconditioned source. History and accomplishment, how the standard was forged. And yes, in case you were wondering, the above is both an historical development and a hard-won accomplishment. Start with the basic intuition Aristotle sharpens whenever something changes. What brings about that change must already be actual in the relevant way. What is merely potential cannot make itself actual. Follow that line, and you are driven to an unmoved mover whose causal role does not depend on prior activation. Aristotle then deepens the point by arguing that the first source must be actuality through and through, since any residue of potential would call for another actualizer and the search would never reach bedrock. Aristotle also notices that real unities are not heaps. Whenever a whole is more than the sum of its parts, there must be something that makes the many to be one. This demand for a cause of unity functions as a pressure test on candidates for ultimacy. If the first principle were internally many, it would either depend on a composer or fail to be genuinely one, and either option would forfeit its status as first. In late antiquity and the medieval period, this Aristotelian grammar became the shared workshop for Jewish, Islamic, and Christian philosophers. Avicenna reframed the question in modal terms. Possible beings have an essence that does not guarantee that they exist. The necessary existent does not have that structure. For it, what it is just is to be. That identity removes the last foothold for inner addition. Where essence and existence are not two, there is nothing for a genus to measure and nothing for a unifier to bind. Maimonides drew the theological consequence with unusual clarity. If one multiplies essential attributes in God as really distinct positives, one either posits a composer that would make God derivative or multiplies uncaused basics and loses unity. To protect divine unity, he disciplines how we speak. We deny creaturely defect and acknowledge that the perfections we name in creatures derive from a source in which they are not additions to a common nature. Aquinas gathers these strands into categorical principles. Every composite is posterior to and dependent on its parts. Every composite has a cause of unity. What is first is not in a genus. From these claims, together with the identity of essence and existence, in God, he concludes that the first cause is absolutely simple. The point is not to thin the divine, but to deny that the first cause is a resultant of prior constituents. Simplicity names independence at the deepest level. Seen as a sequence, the history advances by tightening the same core insight. Aristotle supplies the metaphysical grammar of act and potency, the demand for a unifier, and the refusal to treat being or unity as genera. Avicenna secures necessity at the summit by identifying what the first is with its existing. Maimonides guards unity by refusing to reconstruct God from a cluster of attributes. Aquinas fuses the insights into a worked set of tests that any candidate for ultimacy must pass. It is an accomplishment because it does not rest on authority alone. The result is a profile that different traditions reached by argument and then used as a standard. Pure act, cause of unity, not in a genus, identity of essence and existence in the first, together. These claims interlock so that removing one weakens the whole, yet each also carries its own weight. The network is portable, which is why later thinkers could test new proposals against it and explain precisely where those proposals failed to reach ultimacy. Its significance is also practical. From the profile flow familiar attributes as entailments rather than add-ons. Immutability follows from the absence of potency. Eternity follows from existence that is not measured by temporal succession. Aseity follows from the denial of inner composition and of any genus more general than the first. The achievement is a constitutive picture of what it would be to be the unconditioned source. Finally, calling this a historical development and accomplishment captures both the chronology and the craft. Across centuries and communities, the same questions were pushed to their limits, methods were refined, and results were cross-checked until a shared standard emerged. On that standard, to deny simplicity is not to tweak an optional doctrine, it is to change the subject. One no longer speaks of the unconditioned source, but of a highest within an order. That is why this tradition continues to function as a benchmark in contemporary debates. It is the cross-tradition, work demonstration that reasons search for an ultimate source, via Aristotle's act potency and unity analyses, Avicenna's identity of essence and existence in the first, Maimonides' discipline of predication, and Aquinas' anti-composition axioms, yields a first cause that is pure act, uncaused, not in a genus, identical with its existence, and therefore absolutely simple. Conclusion, revisiting Hart's claim. Hart's line now looks less like a provocation and more like the sober end of an argument. If the first cause must be pure act, if every real many is one only through a unifier, if whatever is first is not in a genus, and if the necessary, existent has no added quiddity, then God names the unconditioned source whose unity is not resultant and whose being is not received. Deny any of those pillars, and you do not merely tweak an attribute. You relocate the subject inside an order of things that depend, or you multiply coordinate basics and lose ultimacy. That is why attempts to keep a maximal deity while discarding simplicity invariably slide into one of two outcomes, either a composite God that requires a cause of unity and so is not first, or a highest instance, among many measured by a common scheme and so not beyond genus. In either case, the referent changes. What remains may be exalted, powerful, even unsurpassable within a system, but it is still within a system. It is not the subsistent act of to be that underwrites every other act in unity. Hart's charge of atheism should be heard in precisely that sense. It is not a verdict about someone's piety or sincerity, nor a denial that one might affirm some deity. It is the judgment that, once the classical accomplishment is in view, rejecting simplicity is rejecting the only object that reason reaches when it carries. The question of why anything is all the way to the end, the absolutely first, simple, non-composite source that is not in a genus and does not receive being. So, does denying divine simplicity amount to atheism? Yes, it does. In this sense, it inevitably withdraws assent from the unconditioned. Source reason discovers and replaces it with a highest within, an order which is a creature by comparison rather than the God whose simplicity. The tradition argued to be the very signature of ultimacy.